Hello, thank you for joining us today at our transit talk for the SEPTA bus revolution. We'll get started very shortly.
A lot of people are rolling in. I think we had close to 600 people register for is that right? That's right, Bianca, yeah. So maybe as we get to close, well, we'll see if the numbers are still going up. So we give people a few more minutes. I was gonna say close to 200 might be a good time.
Why don't we start, Bianca? I think we hit the magic 200 mark, so we can get started.
Sounds good. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight at the Bus Revolution Transit Talk. Before we get started, we're going to go through a few polling questions just to get some more information on everybody in the room. So our first question, is this your first Bus Revolution event? Yes or no? All right, so a lot of us are joining again for additional events, but we've got 27 people or so that are joining us for the first time. So thank you so much for stopping in to hear more about this project. What types of bus revolution activities have you participated in if this is not your first event? So yeah, we can see, thank you for sharing. We've had people join us at other virtual meetings, transit talks, looking on the website and visiting some community meetings. So thank you for staying involved with this project. And one final question, how did you hear about the transit talk today? So most of us received an email reminder to join in. So yeah, thank you again for staying engaged throughout the process. We've also seen some people said you heard about it through word of mouth, or you saw it on our website, which is great. So thank you for stopping in tonight. Now I'll pass it over to Dan Nemiroff with SEPTA to kick off the presentation.
So before we go right to Dan, Bianca, do you want to just talk, this is definitely being recorded, right? And we will be sharing the recording and the slides on the website so people can go back and do that. And then I don't know if there's any way people can turn on closed captioning, or is there any other instructions that we want to give folks about that?
Yes, you should be able to hear. You should be able to turn them on yourself, but I believe they are turned on and enabled. So if you'd like to see captions, you can turn them on.
Okay. And then one last thing before Dan takes it away. We will have some time for question and answer. So if you have a question that you want to pose, you can go to the Q&A function and submit a question for that. We will monitor those questions and then answer them at the end. So I think with that, I think that's all the housekeeping kind of stuff.
Yep.
So off you go.
And some will answer in the Q&A log. We'll kind of try to go through some of it. So good evening, everybody. It's good to see you all again. Thank you for coming out on what I think is going to be the last dry night for a while. Here is the agenda for this evening. We had our welcome. Bianca welcomed you. You generously filled out some questions in the polls. We're going to spend a lot of time just talking about this project generally. I just want to kind of be clear, make people aware, from the outset that we're not going to spend any time going through the recommended network. We are still working on it. We have a lot of work left to do, both, to make sure all of the math works, make sure things work out, but also then to kind of work with our partners to make sure that they understand what we plan on presenting at hearings later in the year. But we'll talk about what that process is if you're not familiar with it, and how you can continue to participate in the process. We'll talk about spring 2023 specifically, what we heard from this last round of engagement, how we anticipate making adjustments, and then we'll talk about, like I said, next steps before the Q&A. Next slide, please. You can go to the next slide. So I saw in the chat there were about 27 new people, but maybe not all of you have been with us since the beginning. And I think what we really need to do is sort of level set and have people understand why we're doing this project now. Since SEPTA came into being, people's travel habits have changed. They go to different places, they travel at different times. The bus network has not kept up with those changes, and that is why we are doing this project. Bus networks need to stay responsive and vital, or they start to atrophy and lose riders. And next slide. And that is where we found ourselves in the mid-2010s, which is when we started looking at redesigning our bus network. Between 2013 and 2019, we lost about 20% of our overall bus ridership. That is a big decrease. It's a big drop, and it really caused us a lot of consternation. We did a project with a different firm in the mid-2010s that looked at the possible justification for doing this type of project, knowing that it's very it can be very difficult for people. Change is difficult. People are used to things. And they did find that there was enough justification to do a redesign. We started getting everything ready in the 2018-2019 timeframe, and then COVID came along, and that really changed the sort of calculus of all of this. We lost a significant amount of ridership overnight, and while bus ridership has been the strongest of our modes to rebound, it's still about 30 to 40% below pre-COVID levels. Prior to COVID, we made buses paid for about 40% of their overall fare box through service. Transit is not a business, but a good bus route can make back about 50 to 60% of its overall costs. But now buses are only making about 20% of their overall cost back. So this is not a sustainable situation for the authority. We're doing a lot of different things to try to get people back onto the system, to get ridership up. This project is sort of part of those suite of things that we're trying to do to make the system more attractive to more people. Next slide, please. So Bus Revolution is a blank slate redesign of our fixed route bus network. It is not a, it's not to say that everything will change. It's just to say that through the course of this project, we've thrown a lot of different ideas out. We've talked through a lot of stuff internally. Some stuff has been well received. Some stuff has not. But the idea was to sort of ask the question, what would we do if there was no SEPTA and we were building a bus network from scratch? Next slide, please. I'm going to hand it off to Bethany now, and she's going to talk about some of the data that's sort of underpinning some of our thoughts and ideas throughout this process.
Great, thanks, Dan. So good evening, everyone. My name's Bethany Whitaker. I'm part of the consultant team that is supporting and assisting SEPTA through this effort. I work for a company called Nelson Nygaard. Many of you may have seen me on one of these transit talks already, but what we wanted to do is to take a minute and look back and say, okay, what did we do when we did this blank slate analysis? What did we find? What was the direction from the data? What did we hear from riders? And sort of how did we get to where we are at this moment? And so I'm going to just take a couple minutes, go back, sort of play the greatest hits of the bus revolution, and then, really show and remind folks how we got to where, how we ended up where we are. So one of the first things that we did, we said in the previous slide, we said we did a market analysis. The market analysis really looks at a combination of things, including population and employment density, looks at socioeconomic characteristics, looks at demographic characteristics, vehicle ownership levels, and we can take that data and tie it to the type of transit service that could be provided or the level of transit service that could be provided. And so one of the key findings that we found through this analysis is that Philadelphia and the surrounding region is an excellent market for transit. There's a lot of need, there's a lot of demand. The land use patterns, the population density, the characteristics of the people in the job, there's a lot of opportunity to provide really high quality transit service. And this is true for the city of Philadelphia, but it's also true for in Center City, of course, but also many of the surrounding neighborhoods to the west, to the north. As you see these sort of brown and mustard colors, those are also places where maybe we don't want to run a bus every 10 or 15 minutes, but we can run one every 30 minutes because there are enough people and enough jobs and enough destinations, places where people want to go. So this idea of making connections to Center City is really important, but also between and to these other neighborhoods and these pockets of demand, and really understanding where people are trying to go. This was a key part of the bus revolution and a key part of some of the recommendations that we looked at. Another thing that we considered was when people were traveling, and one of the findings from the data analysis that came out, primarily through the pandemic, but was already happening even before the pandemic, is this shift away from peak period travel. Transportation planners, and probably you hear Dan and me and other people, Bianca, talk a lot about peak periods. When we say this, what we're really talking about are Monday through Friday, so weekdays, sort of like that traditional Monday through Friday 9 to 5 kind of commute. So times of the day between around 6 or 6:30 to 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, and then around 3 to 5, 4 to 6, sometime around that in the afternoon. And you can see in 2019, the peaks were pretty dramatic and pretty sharp. And a lot of that has to do, SEPTA provides a lot of service during the peak. And then in the fall of 22, we saw it soften quite a bit during the pandemic. And even by the fall of 2022, we saw some of those trends remain. Some of that has to do with the fact that some of the people who work traditional office type jobs were only going back to work some days. They didn't work a 5-day schedule anymore. We also know that there is a lot of employment that isn't Monday through Friday, isn't 9 to 5, and that there is a demand and a need to travel during those times. And so some of the recommendations and some of the things that you see that we were trying to do with Bus Revolution is flatten out that peak, offer consistent levels of service throughout the day and by day of the week. And this, like I said, this is some of the initial analysis that we did back in 2021. And then we also have been doing, and I know not everybody kind of feels this way, but we have been having a lot of conversations with stakeholders, with community groups, with riders. We've issued a handful of surveys that first year, and we did receive over 10,000 responses to one of them. And we asked people what they cared about. And in nearly every conversation, and no matter how we asked it, people told us that some of the key issues facing the bus service were around speed and reliability. This idea that they could walk to the corner, know that the bus was going to come, that it would come on time, that it would get them to where they were going on time. and that they could really count on that. They could predict their trips, they could rely on the service, that this was the biggest challenge that people were talking to us about when we first started this project, and a big part of what we've been hearing throughout. There's been other issues, of course, as well, but this was one of the ones that's really kind of core to some of the things that we looked at with Bus Revolution. And that's what we heard, that's what you all told us. When we looked at the data, we also saw that the data told us that as well. And SEPTA's bus service is quite slow. These red lines in this map here, in Center City, buses are moving around on average 8 miles per hour. So that means some buses are going faster, some are going slower. In sort of Philadelphia, where you see these orange lines, those buses are moving on average around 10 miles per hour. The average speed for bus service in the United States is closer to 13 or 14. So SEPTA is quite a bit slower than that. Some of that is the characteristics of the city of Philadelphia, really narrow streets, cars parked on one side or both sides, tight turns, a lot of pedestrian activity, but it is still slower than we want, and speeding up bus service was a key objective. You can also see we do have a reference here. Pedestrians walk between 3 and 4 miles per hour. 4 miles per hour, of course, is pretty fast pace. That's about a 15-minute mile, but many people do walk around 20 minutes mile. So we want the bus to be faster than that. We don't want people to feel or like they can walk faster than the bus. So that was a key part of our analysis and our findings and some of the things that we were trying to address and fix as part of the bus revolution. The other thing that some of the other key findings, SEPTA has 125 bus routes, right? That's a lot of bus routes. A lot of them do different things. They perform well in different ways. Some of those bus routes are excellent. There are 13 of them that carry more than 10,000 riders per day, which is a phenomenal amount of ridership. Almost every transit agency in the country would love to have these 13 routes. When we were doing Bus Revolution, we really wanted to protect and enhance these 13 routes so that they could perform they would run faster, they would perform better, they would be simpler, more streamlined. But this idea that there's a handful of routes that are really the core was something that we really held on to and carried forward in our analysis. And then sort of the flip of that was that there are still, there's still a lot of work to do. And there was a lot of, not all the remaining 112 bus routes, but there are a lot of bus routes that don't follow best practices, that are really complicated, that don't travel in a direct line, that make lots of turns, that head north and then go west and then circle back south, and that are really confusing to riders and hard for people to understand and start to use the bus. And they tend to take longer in order to get people from point A to point B. So these are just some of the highlights of some of the things that we found. And what we did with all of this information was sort of come up with this strategic approach. The key tenets and the key things that we were trying to do with the bus networks that we've been showing you and getting feedback on. One is to use frequency as a way to make the service more reliable and more consistent. We also tried to really focus on these repeating patterns. So if we're going to operate a bus every 15 minutes, we operate that service every 15 minutes all day, 7 days a week. So we have that sense of reliability and consistency. We also tried to straighten bus routes where we could so that they reduce turns, keep them on a straight path so they're easier to understand. It's also easier to keep them on schedule if we're avoiding a lot of turns. And this, and that was another tool in our toolbox to make service more reliable. We also focused on connections, both to transportation centers, but also regional rail stations, to the Broad Street line, to the Market Frankfurt line, to other frequent bus routes. But this idea that we wanted to make sure that we were building a network that allowed people to get to a lot of different places, to make transfers, to change directions, to have this, kind of series of options that they could use to travel between point A and point B. We also really tried to focus as much of our resources as possible on the high ridership routes, those 13 that I just mentioned, but also many of the other bus routes that are performing really well, carrying a lot of riders, traveling through areas with a lot of high demand. And really, so you do see a lot of, and you'll see this, we're going to walk through some of the networks that we've developed, and you'll see some of this focus of the resources. The other thing that we wanted to do was there are some bus routes in SEPTA's service area that weren't performing as well, that had low levels of service, but we could see in the underlying community that there was a demand and a need for the bus service. So we introducing this concept of on-demand service. Sometimes we call it microtransit. We're trying to say on demand as much as possible, but really matching the service to the service area. And these, this is just kind of a sampling of some of those strategic ideas and principles that we identified through the data, through conversations with riders, and carried forward as we started to develop and share these bus networks. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Dan, and he's going to start to talk about how we develop the bus networks.
Right. Thank you, Bethany. So I'm going to start by talking about kind of the first kind of two steps of where we came from, and then when we shared our two network options from a year ago. And then Bethany will go and talk about the two more recent phases, which are probably the ones you all are more familiar with. So as is the case with all these projects, we start with what's on the street now. Where they go, what streets they run on, what turns work, what turns don't work. The first thing that we did after we sort of got through the introductory part of the project, the existing conditions analysis, was that we introduced two network options. And these were not fully fleshed out options that we felt like you could put on the street that day, but they were more illustrative of different ideas that we wanted to get feedback on. And we weren't really saying we're going to adopt option A or option B. It was let us know what you think about these two options, and we'll sort of build from those to a hybrid that makes more sense and respects that feedback. In fall of 2022, we premiered the initial draft network, which was in our way trying to balance these two things. And we got a ton of feedback. We wound up making a lot of changes based on that feedback. And then this last spring, we had to rebalance everything based on that fall 22 engagement. And that again was trying to interpret what we saw in terms of the feedback, but also trying to balance that with what we were trying to do with the project and frankly, the data that we were using. Is that the data doesn't always reflect what people experience in the field. The way we interpret what people write is not always what they're actually writing. So we had to really break this into two stages to get a better idea of what people were thinking when we showed them the networks and how we could communicate clearly what we were trying to accomplish. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with these two shared options. And again, this is going back quite a bit. You can still find this information available online if you're interested, but there were two different options that we presented. The first option was sort of what we called it was like the most streamlined version of the SEPTA network we could possibly conceive of. It was simpler. There were fewer routes overall, but very frequent routes. Over half of all the routes in the system were coming frequently, which means every 15 minutes or better, 7 days a week between 6 a.m. and 9 p.m. And that reduction in routes is what allows us to run that many routes frequently. This was sort of the most transfer heavy system that we could possibly create. We were able to provide a lot more service consistently in the suburbs than we do now, although on less roads overall. But ultimately, this equated to longer walks and more transfers for some customers. And that was sort of again, we weren't saying, let's adopt network one. It was like, people want frequent service. People prioritize frequency. This is what that really looks like. Next slide, please. Network option two was sort of like what we viewed as the hybrid between the existing network and that sort of very frequent network. We put back a lot of the routes, but there weren't as many frequent routes overall. So the walks were shorter because there were more routes. There was some more direct service, but overall there was less frequent service. It was a little more complicated than that first version, with a little more duplication, but we thought overall this was sort of the right balance of those two things. And we put these two ideas out there. And again, it wasn't, do we adopt A or do we adopt B? It was, tell us what you like about these two different options, and we will take these back into the lab and try to put something together that we think makes sense. Next slide, please. What we learned from that phase of engagement, which I'll say candidly was the most frustrating phase of engagement we had, was that it was really difficult sharing two networks with people, particularly when we're talking about things at a conceptual level. People really, people want to get down to brass tacks. They want to know what we're going to do, and we're saying, we don't know what we want to do, but we have some ideas. Tell us what you think. some people like that process. They like to participate, but a lot of people became frustrated. There wasn't as much information as, perhaps there could have been, because the ideas weren't fully baked out. But the big thing was people like the idea of frequent service, but they're saying, well, okay, but they can't clearly see the trade-off, and we're not doing as good a job of explaining it. And they, it's like, you're giving me frequent service, but what am I losing? And I think that became complicated for us, especially, when we got into sort of these minute details. Are we operating on this block or that block? Are we making this turn or that turn? It became hard to convey those things to people. Next slide.
All right, I think I'm back on deck
Mhm.
here. All right, so, and as Dan mentioned, yes, so we did those 2 network options, got the feedback that Dan explained very clearly, and then we went back to the lab and we came out in the fall with this draft network. Initial draft network, but it was a network that we tried to balance the feedback that we had received so far and get to a place where provide enough frequent service, but we did reduce the number of routes. You see, SEPTA's existing network has 125. In this draft network, we ended up with about 99 routes, but almost half of them were frequent. We had this idea about 10 on-demand zones. When you look at the map, which, I know you can't really read this too well, but you do see all those red lines, all those purple lines. Those are the frequent routes. You don't see a lot of gold lines. That's the hourly service. You can see that the routes are straighter. They're more direct. There's more like a grid. We're using the on-demand transit. So we shared this in the fall, and we did do a lot of engagement. Another thing that before we brought this out to the fall, we really tried to increase the volume of the bus revolution. I think that worked. A lot of people had a lot of concerns, and there was a lot of frustration with what we shared, but we did capture people's attention, and we did hear from a lot of folks. So that was, part of what we learned. But part of what we heard from folks were that the draft network was still complicated, even though we may have felt like we did a lot better job from when we had the 2 network options. The way that we were presenting the network, the way that we were talking about it, and some of the materials that we were sharing was still complicated for folks. They wanted things to be simpler. They wanted things to be a little bit clearer. So that was one of the key messages. And I think a lot of that complication, or at least part of it, was because we weren't using this. We had this like 3-digit bus numbering code that also kind of added a layer that people had to work through to understand what was happening to their bus route. So we did eliminate that, which I'll talk about in a second. So despite the fact that people were they were frustrated with the way that we were presenting the information, they could see what was happening to their individual routes. And we did get a lot of feedback on that. And again, people like this idea of frequency. They like the fact that we're trying to build a network that operates, as many bus routes operate every 10 minutes or every 15 minutes, that service is available on the weekdays as well as the weekend days. But they could see what was happening to their individual routes, and a lot of people were really frustrated with what we were showing them. We did introduce transfers. People did not like some of those transfers. Many people didn't like those transfers, especially when they were making a short trip that was 1 mile or 2 miles. They were concerned when we had some routes that were being eliminated, or portions of routes that were being eliminated. And this, we heard some pushback and some desire to keep more of the existing bus network. So we heard that pretty loudly and clearly. There was a couple of meetings where people were really frustrated. There was also a sense that we hadn't talked to enough people. People were especially concerned about what we were doing with student transportation, how older adults were going to use this network, how people with disabilities were going to be able to get around. And so got a lot of feedback. We took that feedback, and then we came out with another, and we call it the updated draft bus network. This is what we just shared in the spring. You can see that it added some more routes when we went back to our lab, as Dan just called it. Again, we looked at ridership. We looked at ridership by stop, by route, by time of day. We looked at the predominant travel patterns, so where people are traveling, when they're traveling. We wanted to make sure that we we're listening to the community and to the riders and what they were telling us, but making sure that we also checked it with data. And if we made a decision that didn't align with what people were saying, that there was a really strong and clear reason for doing that. So we did add, with the revised or the updated bus network, we did add back in a lot of routes. We did have to bring down the number of frequent bus routes. We also reduced the number of on-demand services. And so even just glancing at the network at a high level, you can see you still see some of those clear, like that strategic perspective, like you can still see how the grid kind of lays out. You still see a lot of red and a lot of purple. You see less than you did in the fall of last year. You see more gold. Those are more hourly routes. And you can tell that the microtransit zones are a little bit smaller. They're a little bit more focused. These are all the things that we responded to based on what we heard and in the fall. So as Dan mentioned, we're still taking all of this information back and we're looking at it again with the data, with the more recent ridership data. We did hear from a lot of people in the past round of engagement, so thank you very much if you dialed into a virtual community meeting or to one of the transit talks or went to one of the in-person community meetings or maybe participated in a presentation. We did hear from folks that they did feel like we were listening and that some of the comments were addressed and people were really grateful for that and they thanked us for that. They still want more frequency. They want more weekend service. They like the simplicity, but so while we heard some positive feedback, we did still hear about some changes in frustration and really this pull to go back to the existing network as much as possible. People want the frequency and the weekend service. We're just trying to really balance making sure that we retain the network where it's working and making sure that we provide those connections, that those are fast and direct connections. And so that's really what our next challenge is about. Again, people asked us, they want to know more about on-demand transit. And I think that that is something that we've been talking a lot about, we've been hearing a lot about, but as it's becoming a little bit more real and this idea continues to stay on the table for some areas, people are like, all right, we really need to understand this. How is it going to work for me? And so that is one of the challenges and one of the things that we'll be doing as we, take the next steps is providing more education, more information about microtransit, especially if we end up transitioning to some of those types of services. And so with that, Dan, you're up for what's next.
Sure. Thank you, Bethany. Okay, so this is sort of the general timeline slide. We started this project way back when, and we are at the point now where we are wrapping up community engagement and transitioning to the recommendation stage. And we are going to begin finalizing recommendations for the bus network that we will bring to hearing. And then in the fall, we'll have those hearings. Next slide, please. So as with the last round of feedback, we got a lot of different engagement. So we've begun the process of doing a detailed review and analysis of that feedback. I recognize some of the names of the people that have provided feedback. Your comments are reviewed. They are put with other comments of similar ilk, so that staff can get a better idea for what the sort of hot button issues are. We also make sure that we pull the most recent ridership data. I've seen a few questions about that, and I know that there's still, some misconceptions about sort of what the primary data sources that we've been using are, but we always pull the most recent data as we begin the process of making revisions and identifying sort of these hotspots. We also continue to work with our partners at the city and the counties to identify any land use changes, demographics, or patterns that we need to be aware of. And we pull cell phone data and we do all kinds of different things to sort of check the work that we're doing against different data sources. We also measure the impacts of route changes on network design, through isochrone mapping, basically how far can you get within a set period of time and what's in that zone. And then we also work with a bunch of different departments within SEPTA, not just the planning department, who are obviously the big part of this, but operations, we do operator engagement. We work with other departments, system safety, that type of thing as we develop recommendations, and we balance the budget. This is a budget neutral project. We are not getting additional operating money to run whatever network winds up going to the board, but we are also not reducing the amount of overall service either on a network level. It's the same number of service hours. It's moved a little bit as this project has progressed because we have made service changes, but we've always adjusted our plans to fit with what we put out in a given sign up, like a scheduled change. Next slide, please. So 2023, or at least the second half of it, is going to be very busy. Throughout the rest of this month and next month, we'll be finalizing the network and preparing materials for these public hearings. In August, we will post the recommended network online. with all of the materials. We will likely have some open houses or at least some virtual meetings to sort of make people, aware of sort of what's been posted, how to read it, that type of thing. I do want to note that the materials that we typically bring for service changes they differ a little bit than what we typically do. We use these, we call them tariffs at SEPTA, and they are, they're pretty straightforward documents. It's a map that shows you the proposed routing, any segments that are proposed for discontinuation, and any new segments that are proposed for addition. That'll all get posted in August, and we will open the formal comment period. So typically when we do hearings, to provide any feedback, you have to attend the hearing. You won't have to do that. You'll be able to go online. You'll be able to look at the route that you want to comment on. You'll be able to see clearly what the proposal is, and you will be able to provide feedback directly to the hearing examiner. The hearings are overseen by an independent hearing examiner. They are not a SEPTA employee. Ultimately, they will, based on the feedback that they get, render a decision and let us know, and then we might have to make adjustments. We will have those hearings in September. Again, typically when we have hearings, we have 1 or 2 hearings. It'll be at 1234 Market Street. We will not be doing that this time. We will have multiple hearings. We will have hearings throughout the region. We will still have hearings at 1234 Market Street, but we'll also have them elsewhere so that people can get to them. People will be able to come in person. There will be a short open house section for people to go around, talk to people on the technical team, look at materials, and ask any questions, and then the hearing will begin. The hearings will be timed. We will have to end them at a certain point, but people will be given, there will be time for people to provide feedback. Anyone who does not have time will be able to provide written testimony at that hearing. Like I just said, we do anticipate having to make up revisions based on those hearings, and we'll take October and November to do that. And then assuming the times work out and we get the hearing examiner's response, within a reasonable amount of time, we would likely seek adoption of a new bus network in December. So that is, from where we sit now on June 20th or whatever the date is, I think it is June 20th. That is how we anticipate the rest of the year going. The hearings will be, it'll be another 2-month open period. There won't be community meetings like we've been doing. We won't be doing a lot of virtual stuff because the hearings are a time for people to provide testimony, not necessarily a time for us to respond. The response comes in October and November once the hearings are complete. Next slide, please. So again, just to kind of summarize, the technical team is confirming what our recommendations will be. We've really appreciate everyone's feedback. Some of it, a lot of it has been really helpful for us as we've gone through this process. We'll be starting to make updates to the Bus Revolution website in June. The recommended network will be posted in August. People are still free to click on the spring 2023 network, but know that when we update everything in August, it will look different. It will have some subtle changes, and it'll be different. It'll be reflective of some of the things that you're hearing now. And then we are busy trying to get all of the hearings scheduled in September. The postings will be put online as soon as we have them. We'll also be posting notices throughout the SEPTA system as we are required to do. Next slide. So thank you very much. We really appreciate everyone coming out tonight. We know people are really eager to hear about their route and their neighborhood, but like I said, the hearings are coming up and they'll be the time for people to provide more input for that. But I think with that, Bianca, we can start the Q&A and see what people are thinking.
Sounds good. Yeah. To kick it off, we have a question. What are you doing to connect buses to regional rail lines?
Well, so I'll start. This is a question that we've got throughout this process. Regional rail is sort of an underused asset that we have in a lot of ways, in part because of the differences in fares and in part because of the frequency. What we have done, and we've made some revisions based on this, is we are focusing on different ways we can connect. We are preparing, I believe it's going to the board later this week, but we are preparing a proposal for all Zone 1 stations to be a transit fare, so people will be able to use the pass for bus and for regional rail, which I think is a huge step in the right direction for SEPTA. I think that will go some ways to making regional rail a more attractive mode and allow for better integration. Obviously, frequency is the other one, but if you haven't already, we do have a reimagining regional rail project that is looking at ways through infrastructure that we can increase the frequency of regional rail.
Thank you. We have a question related to COVID. Was your analysis before or after COVID? Although center city companies are requiring employees to come back, does your data reflect COVID changes?
So we started with pre-COVID numbers when we started this project, which started when Nelson Nygaard was hired, after the pandemic began, but we defaulted to pre-COVID ridership numbers. So 2019, 2018, that time frame. We did look at COVID ridership, but not really to inform decisions, but just to kind of like see what was going on with the trends. As Bethany had said, what's happened during the pandemic has been a lower emphasis on peak hour travel. So we wanted to see if data during the pandemic, at least during the late stages of the pandemic, reflected that was what we were seeing. And I think if you remember the graph shown earlier, you can pretty clearly see that midday ridership is actually higher than it was during I forget what the initial year was, but the issue is that peak ridership is still much, much lower. And while we do anticipate some ridership changing based on people coming back to work, we think that where we are now is where we're going to be for quite a while. It's roughly in line with what other transit agencies have seen. And it's still, I think, it's still something that we need to watch. It's still something that we need to kind of be cognizant of. But, I think the reality is there's a lot more midday travel. There's a greater emphasis on weekend ridership because that's where we can really grow and attract new people. So something that we have to keep an eye on. I don't know, Bethany, if there was something else you wanted to add to that.
No, I think you did a great job answering that. Yeah. And I think that that's also something that we've kind of been adapting, and that's been a part of quote unquote the lab, as you've kind of called it right now, is just this idea that we can go back and look at more updated data, that we're not stuck in what we originally looked at when we started the process.
Have you thought about running extra service to the Center City Entertainment District on weekends?
Sorry, go ahead, Bethany.
I was just going to say that we didn't target that as a strategy, but it's sort of like an outcome of the strategy of the Bus Revolution strategy overall, which has a lot more service on weekends. And the same routes that operate on the weekdays or operate on weekends are more frequent on the weekends. And so that will make it easier to get to and from those entertainment districts.
We have a question. Have you finished meeting with the school district? If so, have you made any alterations to your prior plans as a result of those meetings?
I can take this one too. Dan, give you a second. Yes, so we did hold some meetings with the school district, and we had some special meetings that were designed just for the school district. And we did make some adjustments, or we are making some adjustments based on some of that feedback. And then also, of course, as the network changes, that has an impact on the school district service. So we are looking at both of those things at the same time and making sure that students have access to school.
With the changing of removing some bus lines, what will happen to the SEPTA bus drivers? Will they lose their jobs?
No. The service is being designed basically with the same footprint as we have today. So if you go back earlier, there was a chart that Bethany showed that showed the different permutations of the draft next to our existing network. And the bottom one is the number of service hours. And the number of service hours in our existing network is about 3.8 million annual service hours. We are not cutting those hours. We are reallocating those hours in a different way. So we are trying to build a system that has, roughly the same number, if not more, runs for our operators, and is in no way an attempt to reduce the workforce in that front.
So the bus lab, as you referred to, it sounds interesting. After you work in the lab, what is your experience on the road? For example, have you looked at stop sites, evaluated them for safety, disability, and general convenience? What feedback have you received from experienced drivers on those routes?
So it's a really good question. So the people that have been working, obviously Nelson Nygaard, they're based in different locations. They're not a local firm, but there is a very large group of SEPTA folks that are contributing to this project, all of whom are local and all of whom are bus users. We work very closely with our operations department, not just on the alignments for the routes, but also turning movements and that type of thing to make sure the things that we're putting out on the table are feasible. In terms of stops themselves, and I know there were a few other questions about stops specifically, we will be doing a review of stop locations as part of this project. A lot of our stops are fine. They have no need to change, but we have bus stops that are in the middle of driveways. We have bus stops that are in locations that really should not be bus stops. So we will be looking at ways to speed service up through some amount of stop balancing. And, but that'll be part of the implementation phase of this project, but we are very focused on, what is feasible.
Yeah, and I'll just add quickly to what Dan said. And one of the things we didn't talk about tonight is you all participated in a lot of the sort of outreach. We did a lot of in-reach. Dan and his team did all the in-reach, where they spent a lot of time showing the bus routes to operators, talking to them about what they are. And then also one of the things that's happening kind of behind the scenes is with each iteration of the network, and where we're finding ideas that sort of seem to make sense, that people are appreciating, we're tying them down, we're making sure that there's a location for the bus stop to lay over and wait before it starts at new route. We're looking at places for driver breaks. A lot of those detailed operational questions are things that we're still fleshing out and making sure as we kind of move closer to recommendations, we're really focusing on some of those details.
We have a question, Dan. Can you just explain again, what does on-demand transit actually mean?
On-demand transit is really sort of like Uber or Lyft, but for transit. What people will do to make it work is there's an app on their phone, or there's a call center option if you don't have a cell phone, and you would order a ride. All of the rides have to take place within a designated zone. And generally speaking, you want to order about 20 or 30 minutes before you need that trip. You don't want to order it hours in advance. It works very much like Uber or Lyft or one of those other TNCs. And it's not an option everywhere. It's not something that would work in the city or even dense parts of our suburban service area. But in parts of the suburban service area that are further out, where ridership is low, but there's still definitely some demand and definitely some need, we want to provide some type of option. And the advantage to on-demand versus sort of a fixed route is that on-demand, the plan right now is to use cutaways or vans, not to use large buses, so that there's a lot more flexibility in where that vehicle can go. A fixed route bus, like a bus route, can only go where it's scheduled to go. So if there's a new shopping center that pops up or a new medical facility and a bus can't get in there, it can't get in there. There's nothing we can do about it. It wasn't built to facilitate a 40-foot bus. So on-demand will allow us to serve destinations as they pop up. It'll allow us to be a little bit more responsive. It's not a good replacement for frequent fixed route service, but our whole service area doesn't warrant that type of service. There is some more information available on our project site. If I didn't answer your question well, and there's definitely going to be more information about the zones and the sort of attractions within those zones as we get closer to hearing.
Yeah, and I think one of the other questions that I saw in the Q&A was about the fares for the on-demand. Did you touch on that?
Oh, yeah. So yeah, sorry. That's thanks, Bethany. That somebody did pop that question in. So yeah, in terms of fares, it'll be the same price as a bus trip or a trip on the L or the Broad Street line, and you'll be able to transfer. So right now we don't charge for the first transfer from bus to bus or bus to L, etc. You wouldn't be charged for that. And I believe another part of our fare proposal this month is going to be to make the second transfer as well free. So it'll be fully integrated with the fare technology. So you won't have to pay a premium because you're in a van.
Okay, and I'm going to just tack on one question that I see here about on-demand transit. The vehicles are accessible, so everybody, the service will be accessible, but it is different from ADA paratransit service. So it has some similar characteristics, and if you are, they will be wheelchair equipped, and there will be, you know, some accommodations and that ways that we deliver the service that will be make it a little bit more easier to use for people with disabilities. So it will be fully accessible, but it is a little bit different than paratransit in some ways. And one of the and many of those ways are better. You don't, well, I don't know if better is the right word, but you can reserve a trip 30 minutes in advance as opposed to 24 hours. And there's a bit fewer rules around it. But it will be an accessible service. That's what I wanted to get across.
Yep, an on-demand service would be available to anyone, whereas paratransit service, you know, you have to be eligible for specific programs to get to ride that service. And one other question related to on-demand microtransit service, can you speak to if anything has been done about microtransit and bike compatibility?
Yeah, I think the vehicles will have bike racks on them, so they will be compatible.
All right, we have a question asking, how will the current operator shortage affect the planned changes?
Well, we're hoping it doesn't. Obviously, there's a number of questions in here about the operator shortage that we have and being able to, you know, fill the schedule that we have in place now. We are working very closely with both, you know, our labor relations group, but also operators, as Bethany said, and union leadership to try to figure out ways that we can have this job sort of have this project you know, work with sort of their goals of you know, retaining a workforce and making it an attractive job for people. I think it's something that we'll have to, you know, like I said, keep an eye on. We'll have to make sure that we, you know, adjust plans accordingly. But you know, we aren't able to run a full schedule now, as many people have pointed out, and it's something that we're just going to have to keep working throughout. It's not just this project. It's something that we'll have to focus on as an agency. You know, I don't think it's a situation anybody is particularly enthralled about, but it is something that we have to deal with.
Will there be Zoom hearings?
So yeah, so we are still formalizing all the plans for the hearings. Again, typically we don't do Zoom, although I believe in the era of COVID, we've been doing like budget hearings and stuff remotely. So I don't think that'll be a challenge. I think what we're likely going to do is when we post our materials in August, we will post them with what I can set the stage for everybody. When we do hearings, typically what we do is usually it's just 1, 2, 3 service changes. It's not a huge network redesign, as we've never done this before. Usually a planner will read the service modification aloud, and that is what we will do. We obviously will not be able to do that with 100 and, you know, so many routes, because, you know, everything is going to be presented because it's being presented as a network. And what we will likely do is read sort of a project narrative, talking about the data, talking about the need for this type of project, before opening up the floor for feedback and input. We will likely post something like that online when we launch, and then we will definitely sort of provide virtual hearings. We haven't figured out all the logistics yet because we're not having all the meetings at our offices, so we don't have control over every aspect of them, but we definitely will have a virtual component.
I have a question about stakeholder involvement. Have you conferred with Penn Medicine and CHOP?
Yeah, we actually did a CHOP town hall today. We've talked to Penn Medicine. We talked to them last week. We've worked with stakeholders throughout the region. We've provided a lot of feedback. We've made some adjustments. We've worked with them to make sure that you know, their employees, you know, get the information that they need. But yeah, it's part of this process.
Looking at timeline, when will stop removals or additions for the new routes be happening?
So in terms of implementation, we anticipate, sorry, my all this stuff working. But we anticipate after the hearings and after the board, we anticipate implementation beginning next year, but that doesn't mean on January 1st, 2024, we'll be implementing a new bus network. There's a lot of work that goes into that. I think going through the stops, ordering new signs, posting new signs, that all takes a while. In terms of the decisions about, whether or not certain stops are being kept or proposed for elimination, that is something that will play out publicly when we launch our sort of the communication stage of the project, the implementation next year early. We will definitely be talking about bus stops. We'll be sharing with people what our plans are. I don't think we covered it much today, but we have the closest stop spacing of any transit agency in the country. We have some bus routes where the average stop spacing is less than like 350 feet, which is pretty insane when you think about it. It makes our service really slow. It makes it really unreliable. And as I said before, we have bus stops in locations that simply just should not be bus stops. So we have to go through a really detailed analysis of where our stops are. The fewer stops we have, the more we can focus on improved amenities with our partners. We have identified some capital funding to invest in better bus stops, which we are excited to use, but we need to be able to, reduce the number of stops we have so we can figure out where to best prioritize.
Are you also working with the city, such as PPA, to get traffic as a whole to move more smoothly? I believe that cameras on the 21 and 42 showed a lot of vehicles still traveling in the painted red bus lanes.
So we have begun this process. We have a very active transit priority group with the city of Philadelphia. If you've seen some red lanes on Chestnut Street, they've gone in on parts of Market Street as well. So we are really excited about this. The automatic camera enforcement on the buses, that type of thing. I think these are all part of improvements that we want to see happen in Philly and the surrounding areas a lot more frequently. I think part of our mission in consolidating our services onto fewer streets, it is a push in that direction. It allows us to better leverage the frequency of service and our investment in service with that capital investment. And as with bus stops, we have identified money in our capital budget to put towards these types of improvements. Some of them take a long time, but we are committed to sort of working with the city primarily, but also our other partners to try to bring these investments to fruition, to get service moving faster and more reliably.
We're getting to the end here. We have a few more questions we can probably answer. How will this new effort affect the overall cost to ride?
It will not. I mean, I don't know if at any point prior to implementation there will be a fare increase. That's sort of outside of my purview and certainly above my pay grade. But we aren't proposing any change in fares as part of this. When we eliminated the transfer penalty in 2020, that was something that a bunch of us had worked on and really pushed hard because it was not something that should have been in there in the first place, but it makes redesigning the network a little bit easier. It does remove one of those barriers, which is that additional cost, but we aren't anticipating, at least as part of this project, an increase in fares. But that's not to say there won't be one. I don't know the answer to that one fully.
But there is going to be some plan changes to make things a little bit cheaper. You mentioned the regional rail and but also isn't it going to be the second transfer is also free in the upcoming, or that's not something?
Yeah, no, that is something that is part of the fair hearings, I believe, is the elimination of the regional rail stations will be in the city. So any zone 1 stations, you'll be able to use a transit pass. So the same pass that you use to get on a bus or the L, it'll be the same fare effectively.
All right, I think we're just about at time.
So yeah, so first of all, again, thank you very much. We really appreciate all the time that you spent with us tonight and throughout this process. we are, we are we're really focused on getting materials ready for hearings. So really the next time you'll hear from us, I'll probably be in August. We'll definitely be doing some website updates up till then. But in August is when we'll launch everything, when we'll put the materials on the site, when you'll be able to review the materials, the hearing materials, you'll be able to see what the proposed network is. And again, and we will be opening commenting up at that time. We'll also likely have another one of these Zooms at that time. Again, we won't be able to answer a lot of direct questions because that's what the hearings are for. But we will be able to sort of walk people through the different materials that we have and make sure people understand, what the hearing process is, where the hearings are, what the rules are for hearings, like how to read a tariff, that type of thing. So you'll hear from us again in August. And again, thank you for all the time that you spent.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. We really appreciate your time and attention tonight. All right, have a good evening. Hope everybody enjoys the summer evening.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.